There comes a moment in life when we feel a stirring deep within us, a pull towards something greater than ourselves. It's not ambition. It's not a craving for recognition. It's a call, one that doesn't originate from the expectations of others, but from the one who created us. To be called to serve God is not a duty, it's a divine invitation. An invitation to step into something beyond our own limitations, beyond our fears, and beyond the smallness of self-doubt. But let's be honest. When that call comes, it's rarely at a time when we feel fully prepared. More often than not, it comes when we feel inadequate, unqualified, or overwhelmed by life circumstances. And that's exactly why many people hesitate. Because the moment we recognize the call, we also recognize everything within us that seems to stand in the way. Do I have what it takes? Can I really do this? What if I fail? What if I'm not enough? We start measuring the size of our calling against the size of our own perceived shortcomings. And in doing so, we risk shrinking the call of God to the level of our comfort. But here's what we need to understand. God does not call the perfect. He does not call the fearless. He does not call the ones who have it all figured out. He calls the willing. He calls the ones who, despite their fears, are willing to trust him. He calls the ones who say, I don't feel ready, but I know you are with me. Think about Moses, a man who stood before a burning bush, hearing the voice of God tell him that he was chosen to lead an entire nation out of captivity. And what was his response? God, I'm not a good speaker. What if they don't listen to me? He had a list of reasons why he wasn't the right person for the job, but God wasn't asking for his qualifications. And that's what we often get wrong. We think serving God is about how strong we are, how gifted we are, how much we know, but God is not limited by our limitations. In fact, he uses them to reveal his strength. He calls us not because we are enough, but because he. So when we feel the weight of the calling, we have a choice. We can let fear talk us out of it, or we can trust that if God has called us, he has already placed within us everything we need to walk it out. And even in the areas where we feel weak, he is ready to equip us as we move forward. Too many times we wait for a feeling of readiness. We wait to feel strong enough, confident enough, spiritual enough. But waiting for the perfect moment will keep us stagnant. The moment will never feel perfect. The circumstances will never be ideal. If we keep waiting, we will miss the very thing we were created for. And I don't know about you, but I refuse to live a life where I look back and realize I let fear silence my obedience. I refuse to allow negative emotions to keep me from the very thing that gives my life meaning. I refuse to stay on the sidelines when I know I was called to step in. Because here's the truth, serving God is not about us. It's not about how we feel. It's not about whether or not we think we are capable. It's about surrender. It's about saying, God, I don't have all the answers, but I trust that you do. I don't see the full picture, but I trust that you do. I don't feel qualified, but I trust that you are the one who qualifies me. And when we shift our focus from our limitations to his power, everything changes. The fear that once seemed so paralyzing begins to lose its grip. The doubts that once filled our minds become whispers instead of roadblocks, because we are no longer relying on ourselves. We are leaning into the one who called us in the first place. So if you are feeling unqualified, uncertain, or overwhelmed, you are exactly where God wants to meet you. You don't have to have it all together. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing. And when you say yes, when you take that first step, you will see that everything you thought disqualified you is the very thing God will use for his glory. And that right there is the power of saying yes to the call. There's something we don't talk about enough when it comes to serving God. Something that happens the moment we step forward in obedience. It's not always a burst of confidence. It's not always immediate clarity. Sometimes what shows up instead is resistance. Resistance in the form of fear, doubt, discouragement, and even frustration. It's that unsettling feeling of wondering if you're actually capable of doing what God has asked you to do. It's the thoughts that creep in late at night, telling you that maybe you heard him wrong. Maybe you're not the right person for this. Maybe you should step back before you fail. I need you to hear me on this. Negative feelings do not mean you are on the wrong path. In fact, sometimes they are confirmation that you are stepping into something significant, because the enemy does not attack what is not a threat. He does not waste his time on what has no purpose. If you are feeling resistance, it's because what you are carrying is powerful. But what do we do with these emotions? How do we keep moving forward when everything inside of us wants to retreat? The mistake we often make is assuming that because we feel fear, we must submit to it. Because we feel doubt, we must be disqualified. Because we feel weary, we must not be strong enough. That is a lie. Negative feelings are not a stop sign. They are not an indicator that you should turn around. They are simply evidence that you are human. They are part of the journey, not the end of it. And when we learn how to face them, rather than be controlled by them, we step into a new level of faith. Think about Elijah, a prophet who called down fire from heaven, a man who witnessed miracles with his own eyes. And yet, after one threat from Jezebel, fear overtook him and he ran. He hid in a cave, asking God to take his life. Can you imagine that? A man who had just seen the power of God move so clearly, now overcome with fear and despair. But God did not condemn him for his emotions. God did not say, Elijah, you should be stronger than this. Instead, God met him in that place. He reminded him that he was still with him, still speaking, still guiding him forward. And that is the heart of God toward us. He does not abandon us in our struggle. He does not expect us to pretend we don't feel what we feel, but he does call us to keep going. Because feelings are temporary, but God's calling is permanent. One of the greatest strategies of the enemy is to make you believe that how you feel right now is how you will always feel. He will convince you that because you are discouraged today, you will be discouraged forever. That because you feel weak in this moment, you will always be weak. But that is not true. We have all had days where we woke up feeling tired, unmotivated, or even hopeless. But then something happened. A conversation, a word of encouragement, a reminder of what we are working toward. And suddenly the feeling that seemed so overwhelming began to fade. Why? Because feelings shift. They are influenced by circumstances, by perspective, by truth. And this is why we cannot make decisions based on them. If we let fear dictate our steps, we will stay in places we were never meant to stay. If we let doubt determine our obedience, we will never step into the fullness of what God has for us. If we let discouragement control us, we will give up on things that still have life in them. So instead of asking, how do I stop feeling fear? Ask, how do I move forward despite it? Instead of waiting for doubt to disappear, ask, what does God say about this situation? Instead of being paralyzed by discouragement, ask, what truth can I hold on to right now? Because the truth is, God does not call you based on how you feel. He calls you based on who he created you to be, and he sees beyond this moment. He sees beyond your emotions. He sees the version of you that is fully walking in purpose, fully trusting Him, fully surrendered. So no, you don't have to wait for the fear to leave before you move. You don't have to wait for doubt to vanish before you step forward. You don't have to wait for the perfect emotional state to serve. You just have to say yes. Because the enemy's greatest weapon is not the presence of negative emotions. It's convincing you that those emotions mean you should stop. And I came to tell you today, don't stop. Keep going. Keep trusting. Keep moving forward. Because God's plan for you does not change just because you're having a hard day. His calling remains. And as long as you keep walking, you will see it come to pass. There's something that happens when we go through challenges, something that tries to convince us that difficulty is a sign we're in the wrong place. When things don't go as planned, when we face resistance, when we feel discouraged, the first thought that often comes to mind is maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Maybe this isn't for me. But what if I told you that the very thing you see as a burden is actually an opportunity? What if the struggle you are facing isn't a sign to turn back, but a sign to grow? Too often we allow hardship to define our decisions. We assume that if something is difficult, it must mean we are not meant to do it. But the reality is, struggle is not the enemy. Struggle is often the tool God uses to develop us. The things that feel the hardest in the moment are the things that stretch us, strengthen us, and prepare us for the very thing we have been called to do. Think about Joseph, a man with a promise from God, a vision of greatness. But before he could step into it, he was betrayed by his own brothers, thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, falsely accused, and imprisoned. Imagine how he must have felt. Imagine the thoughts that must have gone through his mind. God, did I hear you wrong? Why is this happening to me? If you called me, why does it feel like everything is falling apart? But what Joseph didn't see in those moments was the bigger picture. He didn't see that the pit was not his final destination, that slavery was not the end of his story, that the prison was just a step toward the palace. And that's what so many of us miss when we are in the middle of our struggle. We see the difficulty, but we don't see what it's doing in us. Because God doesn't waste pain. He doesn't allow challenges without purpose. Every hardship, every closed door, every moment of doubt, it's all part of the refining process. And if we would just shift our perspective, if we would stop seeing struggle as a burden and start seeing it as preparation, we would move differently. We wouldn't give up so quickly. We wouldn't question God's plans just because they don't look like we expected. We wouldn't allow temporary discomfort to make us abandon permanent purpose. Because the truth is, if you are feeling stretched right now, if you are walking through difficulty, it means something is growing in you. It means there is more inside of you than you even realize. And what you are facing is not meant to break you, it is meant to shape you. Look at David. Before he ever became king, he was a shepherd. He spent years in the wilderness, fighting lions and bears, dealing with isolation, facing opposition. He wasn't sitting on a throne. He was out in the fields, learning how to be faithful with what seemed small. But what David didn't realize at the time was that the same battles he was fighting in the wilderness were the very battles that prepared him to take down Goliath. If David had despised the process, if he had looked at his struggles as pointless, he would have never been ready for his moment of destiny. And that's what I need someone to hear today. Your struggle is not pointless. Your hardship is not wasted. The thing that feels like it's holding you back might be the very thing that is pushing you forward. Because strength isn't built in comfort. Faith isn't developed in ease. Purpose isn't fulfilled without perseverance. So don't let the struggle fool you. Don't let the difficulty make you believe that God has forgotten you. What you are walking through is not the end of your story. It is the beginning of something greater. And I know it's hard. I know there are moments where you want to quit. Moments where you wonder if it's worth it. Moments where you feel like you don't have the strength to keep going. But I promise you, if you keep pushing, if you keep trusting, if you keep showing up, you will see that every single battle was leading you to exactly where you are meant to be. So instead of running from the struggle, embrace it. Instead of seeing it as a burden, see it as an opportunity. Because one day you will look back and realize that what you thought was breaking you was actually building you all along. One of the greatest battles we face in life is the battle between what we feel and what we know. Feelings are powerful. They can push us forward or hold us back. They can inspire us or paralyze us. And for so many people, feelings dictate their decisions, their actions, and ultimately their destiny. But here's the problem. Feelings change. They shift with circumstances. They rise and fall with situations. And if we allow them to lead us, we will live a life of inconsistency, always moving in whatever direction our emotions take us. But when God calls us to serve, He doesn't call us to move based on what we feel. He calls us to move based on what we believe. And belief is deeper than emotion. Belief is rooted in truth. Because if we only serve when we feel strong, what happens when we feel weak? If we only serve when we feel excited, what happens when we feel discouraged? The mistake we often make is thinking that feelings should come first, that we should wait until we feel ready, wait until we feel confident, wait until we feel joy before we step out in faith. But that's not how it works, because feelings follow action. When we move in obedience, when we step out in faith, when we choose to serve despite how we feel, our emotions will eventually catch up. Think about Peter walking on water. The moment he stepped out of the boat, he wasn't walking on confidence, he was walking on trust. He wasn't relying on how he felt, he was relying on the word that Jesus spoke to him. But the second he started focusing on the wind, on the waves, on everything around him that told him he shouldn't be able to do this, fear took over. And as soon as fear became his focus, he began to sink. That is exactly what happens when we allow our emotions to lead us. When we focus on fear, we sink in fear. When we focus on doubt, we sink in doubt. When we focus on discouragement, we sink in discouragement. But when we focus on Jesus, when we hold on to His word instead of our feelings, we can do the impossible. And this is why faith is so crucial, because faith is not a feeling, it is a decision to trust even when you don't understand, a decision to obey even when it doesn't make sense, a decision to serve even when it's hard. And when you choose faith over feelings, you step into a new level of strength. You begin to see that your emotions do not define your purpose. God does. The enemy knows that if he can control your emotions, he can control your actions. If he can make you feel unworthy, he can keep you from stepping into what God has called you to do. If he can make you feel discouraged, he can make you give up before you see the promise. If he can make you feel afraid, he can stop you from moving forward. But the enemy's greatest weapon is only effective if you let it be. Because the moment you decide, I will not be led by my feelings, I will be led by my faith, everything changes. That is why serving God requires discipline. It requires consistency. It requires showing up even on the days when you don't feel like it. Because every time you choose to serve despite your emotions, you are training your spirit to lead instead of your flesh. You are building endurance. You are growing in strength. And before you know it, the feelings that once controlled you will lose their power over you. Some of the greatest moments in your life will come on the other side of pushing past your emotions. Some of the greatest breakthroughs will happen when you choose to keep going, even when you feel like quitting. Some of the greatest testimonies will come when you decide, I'm not going to wait until I feel ready. I'm going to move now. So today, choose faith over feelings. Choose obedience over convenience. Choose purpose over comfort. And watch as God takes you further than you ever imagined. One of the most dangerous things we can do when we are struggling is to isolate ourselves. Because when we isolate ourselves, we magnify our emotions. We give our doubts more space to grow. We let fear become louder than truth. And before we know it, we are convinced that we are alone in what we're going through. But the truth is, we were never meant to do life alone. We were never meant to carry the weight of our calling by ourselves. From the very beginning, God created us for relationship with Him and with others. And yet, when we are in a battle, our first instinct is often to withdraw. We think no one will understand, no one can help me. I just need to figure this out on my own. But that is exactly what the enemy wants. Because if he can get you alone, he can get you to believe the lies. This is why community matters. Not just any community, but the right community. People who will remind you of truth when your emotions try to convince you otherwise. People who will stand in faith when you feel weak. People who will call out the greatness in you when all you see are your failures. Because there will be moments in your journey when you don't feel strong enough to stand on your own. And in those moments, the people around you will either pull you up or pull you further down. Look at Moses, a man chosen by God to lead an entire nation to freedom. But even with a calling that great, there came a moment when he was too weak to keep going. During a battle, as long as his hands were lifted, his people were winning. But as soon as he got tired and his arms dropped, the enemy started to prevail. And what happened? Aaron and Hur came beside him, held up his hands, and gave him the strength to keep going. There is something powerful about having people in your life who refuse to let you give up. People who will fight for you when you're too tired to fight for yourself. People who will remind you of what God said when your emotions try to tell you otherwise. And that's why isolation is never the answer. Because the right people will always point you back to truth. But let's be honest. Sometimes we struggle to trust people because we've been hurt before. We've opened up in the past and it wasn't received well. We've shared our struggles and they were used against us. And so we convince ourselves that it's safer to just keep everything to ourselves. But keeping everything to yourself is not strength. Strength is allowing the right people to walk with you. Strength is knowing that you don't have to pretend to be okay when you're not. Strength is realizing that your healing, your growth, and your purpose are too important to let past wounds keep you from the relationships you need. Jesus himself walked in community. The Son of God, the one who had all power, all wisdom, all authority, chose to walk closely with people. He had his 12 disciples, and even within that, he had Peter, James, and John, his inner circle. And if Jesus, in all his perfection, saw the need for deep, trusted relationships, how much more do we? There are things you cannot overcome on your own. There are battles you cannot win in isolation. And the enemy knows that if he can get you by yourself, he can get you to surrender. But when you have the right people around you, you have strength beyond your own. You have wisdom beyond your own. You have faith beyond your own. And that kind of support is what will keep you moving forward, even in the hardest moments. So if you've been trying to do this alone, stop. If you've been carrying burdens that are too heavy, release them. If you've convinced yourself that no one will understand, challenge that belief. Because the truth is, God has placed people in your life who are meant to walk with you, encourage you, and remind you that you are not alone. And when you lean into the right relationships, when you allow people to hold up your arms when you're weary, you will realize that the weight of your calling is never too heavy when you are not carrying it by yourself. There comes a point in your journey when you have to make a decision. Either you allow your feelings to control you or you take authority over them. Either you let fear dictate your steps or you walk by faith. Either you surrender to discouragement or you stand firm in what God has spoken over your life. Because the reality is negative feelings will always come. There will always be moments of doubt, moments of fear, moments of frustration. But just because they show up doesn't mean they have to stay. One of the greatest tricks of the enemy is to convince you that you are powerless against your emotions. That if you feel anxious, you have to live in anxiety. That if you feel weak, you have to remain weak. That if you feel like giving up, you have no choice but to quit. But that is not true. You have more authority than you realize. You are not a slave to your emotions. You have been given the power to overcome them. Look at Jesus. On the night before he went to the cross, he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, overwhelmed with sorrow. He knew the suffering that was coming. He knew the weight of what he was about to endure. And in that moment, he could have allowed his emotions to take over. He could have said, this is too much. I can't do this. But instead, he surrendered his feelings to the will of the Father. He said, not my will, but yours be done. That is what it looks like to take authority over your emotions. It's not about pretending you don't feel what you feel. It's about refusing to let those feelings lead you. It's about acknowledging them, but not being controlled by them. It's about saying, yes, this is hard. Yes, this is painful. Yes, I feel uncertain. But I trust God more than I trust my emotion. And that's the key, trust. Because when you trust God, you don't make decisions based on temporary emotions. You don't let a bad day convince you that your calling has changed. You don't allow a moment of doubt to define your destiny. You stand firm on what you know, even when what you feel is trying to shake you. David had to do this. There was a moment in his life when everything seemed to be falling apart. His own men turned against him. The people who had been by his side were now ready to stone him. And in that moment, he had every reason to give up. He had every reason to believe that maybe he wasn't meant to be king, that maybe he had failed beyond recovery. But instead of sinking into despair, the Bible says David encouraged himself in the Lord. He didn't wait for his emotions to shift before he got up. He didn't wait for someone else to encourage him. He took authority over his feelings, reminded himself of who God is, and strengthened himself in the truth. And because of that, he was able to keep going. That is the kind of mindset you need to have, because there will be days when you don't feel strong, days when no one is there to remind you of your purpose. Days when it seems like everything is against you. And in those moments, you have to make a decision. Either you let your emotions dictate your life, or you rise up and take authority over them. Taking authority means speaking truth over your life, even when you don't feel like it. It means declaring God's promises, even when your circumstances don't match them. It means saying, I am more than a conqueror, even when you feel defeated. It means saying, God is for me, even when everything around you feels like opposition. Because your feelings are not the final authority. God is. And when you walk in that truth, when you refuse to let emotions rule you, you become unstoppable. You begin to move in a confidence that is not based on how you feel, but on who God is. And that is when you truly step into the fullness of your calling. So today, make the decision to take authority over your emotions. Make the decision to trust God more than your feelings. Make the decision to walk in faith no matter what. Because when you do, nothing, not fear, not doubt, not discouragement, will be able to hold you back from everything God has for you.